Welcome to episode 3 of WFH, the New Reality Podcast, the show that helps you identify your passion and turn it into an online business and so much more. If you're returning to this podcast, thank you for subscribing. And if this is your first time listening, then please subscribe. If you like this podcast, please leave a rating and review through whichever podcasting app you're using to listen to the show. In this episode, we'll be continuing our 7-part series on discovering your passion. So let's dive into our 7-part series. This is part 2, and in this episode, we'll be asking the question, who is your ideal market? If you haven't heard part 1 yet, questions to ask yourself, then I suggest you do that before listening to this episode. Now that we've identified your passion in part 1, the next step is to determine if there is a market for what you have to offer. So the market, or market fit, is basically the people who would want and use your product or service. Think then about who would benefit from your knowledge and experience. Is the market big enough so that you could profit from it? Where would you find the people most likely to use your product or service? To discover your market fit, the easiest thing to do is research online. You can use a free keyword search tool such as Uber suggests. So think of your work from home idea and the keyword for it. Go online and search for that word, phrase or keyword term. What we want to discover are the average monthly searches for that keyword. This will give us some indication of what the market size could potentially be. Now that we know how to determine the market fit for our product or service through the research we've done, we can start to think about our potential customers and better understand their needs. So coming up in the next episode, now that we've identified who your ideal market is, in part 3 we'll take a look at the question, what are their needs and fears? So now let's just consider some news about the progress of this podcast. From the analytics that I've been looking at, it seems at the moment that the following are the countries where the audience at the moment is residing. So first of all, we have the USA, the UK, France, Nigeria and Germany. And also it would seem that most of the people listening to the podcast at the moment are all 100% male. So thank you to all of those who are currently supporting this show by subscribing to it. Now, to be able to access this show, there are a number of different podcast directories where this show is currently available, so I'll just mention these because not everyone is obviously using the same app to be able to listen to their podcasts. So at the moment, the podcast is in the following places: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Radio Public, Overcast, Castbox, Spotify, Breaker, Deezer, Podcast Addict and Listen Notes. Now if you like this podcast, then please subscribe to it. And to help reach even more people with this podcast, please share it with your friends, family and colleagues as well. Did you know that this show has a Facebook fan page? I'd love to be able to engage with you outside of this podcast, so you can follow us on all our social media platforms. That way you can keep up to date with all the other things connected to this show's activities. So join us using the links that you'll see in the show notes. Now if there's a topic you'd like covered in this podcast relevant to working from home, you can leave a voice message. Or if you have a question or some feedback, you can use the link for that too. I'd love to hear from listeners and get to know how this podcast can be improved and cover the topics that you want to hear about and be covered in the show. Again, the link for that is also in the show notes. If you'd like to support this show, there's a PayPal support link in the podcast show notes. You can donate as little or as much as you can afford. This would help keep this podcast on air. Your donations are appreciated. So that concludes this episode. We hope you'll join us next time as we continue this 7-part series.